science, we now have pretty strong evidence that the universe is not eternal in the past, but had an absolute beginning about 14 billion years ago in a cataclysmic event known as the Big Bang. What makes the Big Bang so startling is that it represents the origin of the universe from literally nothing. For all matter and energy, even physical space and time themselves, came into being at the Big Bang. As the physicist Paul Davies explains, the coming into being of the universe, as discussed in modern science, is not just a matter of imposing some sort of organization upon a previous incoherent state, but literally the coming into being of all physical things from nothing. That description...
Alright, this is that... It's a video of a debate between William Lane Craig and Victor Stenger at Oregon State University in 2010. It's so irritating, this bit, because this particular bit you just heard, that's William Lane Craig giving his really incoherent and bogus laying out of the cosmological argument for the existence of God, and quoting Paul Davies, who's a respectable scientist. He's quoting Paul Davies doing an interview there, by the way, not Paul Davies in a scientific article or any kind of book that he's written. It's an interview with a journalist, and in interviews with journalists, of course, scientists have to tailor their language to suit their audience, and William Lane Craig is doing that. But listen to what he's saying now. He says, the universe literally coming into being. Now, it's a bit of a shame Paul Davies used the word literally, but William Lane Craig's picking up on that. Because listen what it means. The universe literally coming into being from nothing. Now, it might sound perfectly sensible, but that really is not a literal sentence. That's what's called a conceptual metaphor, or a cognitive metaphor, as they're sometimes called. Literally coming into being is not a literal statement. It's... I'll just give you a little bit of background on that, as quick as I can, really. Conceptual metaphor comes out of a body of thought to do with how the brain works, how the mind works, how language works, and and how we as kind of conscious beings interact with the world and derive systems for thinking about things, particularly thinking about things which are beyond the reach of our senses. Because when you think about it, our capacity to be able to think of things that we aren't directly in touch with. I can touch this phone, so that's fine, I can talk about that. But there's lots of things I talk about that I'm not in direct contact with. Lots of abstract ideas. So how do we do that? And the way that cognitive linguistics and allied fields talk about it is we think about these things through the use of metaphor and other kind of poetic tropes. And the ones that William Lane Craig is quoting from Paul Davies there is a classic example of that. When we want to describe something that emerges, or that we want to find a way to describe it. See, I can't even use the language. Describe its existence. We can't talk about it directly. We can't talk about the beginning of the universe directly. Firstly, because we weren't there, but secondly, because the kinds of physics that were in operation then are way out of the range of our senses. Our senses and the brains that kind of power and process the data from our senses are designed for medium-scale activity. We evolved as medium-sized objects moving at medium speed, as Richard Dawkins says. And we have the brains that are evolved to work at that scale and to interpret the world around us in appropriate and efficient and economical ways. And the kinds of physics and the kinds of logic that we've derived really operates really well at that scale. But it's not very good at operating outside that scale. It wasn't designed. We weren't designed to see quarks and to put our hand into seventh dimensions and any of that kind of stuff. We just weren't designed for it, and we certainly weren't designed to experience, let alone think and talk about the events that happened in the first few nanoseconds of the beginning of the universe. We weren't designed to think about that, and we haven't got we don't naturally have the tools for that. Now we can produce some tools, and mathematics is probably the most powerful tool we can produce so far for allowing ourselves to not be constrained by the senses that we have and the thought and language that corresponds to those senses. But language is not very good at it. Spoken language is not very good at it. And to the extent that spoken language does work, it works through these things like metaphors. So we talk about the universe coming into existence as if it was in another room and it walks through the door and here it is, because we've got experiences of things coming into places. We ourselves come into places all the time. So we're we have a completely embodied physical, material, visceral, tactile, sensory engagement with things coming into existence. Yes, not coming into existence, but coming into places. We know what those journeys and those transitions and those occupations involve. And so we use it as a metaphor to talk about the beginning of the universe. But it's not literal. And the fact that William Lane Craig has jumped on this, it's literally coming into existence, and then basically just spinning out a really, really facile explanation of a so-called God based on this completely trite understanding of an offhand comment made in a journalistic interview by a respected scientist is just rubbish. I mean, that's the kind of, if you take metaphors literally, it produces strange artifacts. That's how it works, Taking metaphors literally produces artifacts. And the whole God that William Lane Craig talks about is effectively an artifact of his taking the metaphor of coming into existence from nothing literally. If you come into a place from somewhere else, then you want to take that literally, you're obliged to describe what was in the other room, where that thing came from. And so he's having to do some work now to generate ideas that really are generated just by the misapplication of a metaphor. So shit. You're a wanker, Craig, a wanker. Anyway, I don't think I've been very coherent there anyway. But this whole idea, this coming into existence thing, a lot of it is to do with natural language. And unless you're really policing your language and recognise that you're talking poetically a long time and know a lot of the time and know what the limits are of that, and recognise when you have to kind of accept that that you're in danger of creating artifacts artificially just because of an application of a metaphor, then you're just on a hide to nothing really. And that's what William Lane Craig and a lot of other apologists do all the time, unfortunately. And the weird paradox, this is off topic slightly, but the weird paradox I always find irritating in these things is, what is a religious apologist doing looking for literal explanations? I mean, that's what I can't understand. He's trying to explain, his claim at least seems to be, that he wants to explain the transcendent, yeah? Or something like it. But he wants to explain the transcendent in terms of the most banal and the most recognisable and the simplest. You know what I mean? Why would anybody do that? It's so irritating. It's the worst application of science to the worst application of religion, it seems to me. God.